Nonetheless, the important question had been answered. The men outside were enemies, and he had to escape. Armed confrontation was just too risky. What other way out of the apartment was there? The only door out to the apartment house hallway was in the living room. Wait a second. There was also the window right over there. He could easily fit through, but he was still on the 50th floor. And even jumping terrace to terrace, there was no way he could rappel himself down that far. But if he could find a rope, perhaps he could lower himself down to the terrace below, break in, escape through that living room, if the neighbors were away. 50L, 49L, that would be the Herberts. Only the Herberts had moved out last month when Mr. Herbert's realty company went under. The apartment was still vacant. Elliot returned to the bedroom storage closet, flipped on the light, and began scratching around. First, he needed a strong rope, at least 20 feet, and he began searching for the nylon rope used to tie up the family's speedboat on Lake Winnipesaukee. They always took it home for the winter after having had 2 such ropes disappear from the boathouse. He didn't find it. Damn! His father must have forgotten, and by now somebody else would have stolen it too. Elliot smiled to himself as he realized that it didn't matter anymore. A few additional minutes provided nothing more promising than 25 feet of plastic clothesline that he had found on top of a carton filled with copies of Not Worth a Continental. Elliot measured out the line to a bit over 4 arm span, then tested it. The line would stretch like all hell, but perhaps if he were to double it over, it might support his weight. If he swore off sex and hard liquor for the rest of his life, and there were a full moon for good measure. Wasting no time, Elliot went over to the terrace window. He had opened it only an inch when he heard a loud thud from behind. Elliot whirled around, but no one was there. Then he realized what had happened. The change in air pressure from opening a high-rise window had caused the slightly ajar bedroom door to slam. Immediately, Elliot drew his gun, then dropped automatically into a one-knee shooting stance, aiming directly at the door. He was breathing very heavily, nervous, sharp breaths. No one entered. He waited in that position, but still no one entered. Then he quietly crept to the door. Pressing his ear against it, he heard, just barely, the 2 men still talking in the living room. Either they had not heard anything, or they had discounted it. Relaxing enough to reholster his gun, Elliot returned to the window, now opening it without difficulty. It seemed somewhat colder than during daylight hours. As he climbed out, he could see his breath illuminated by the bedroom lights. The moon was about as far from full as it could get. The terrace faced Park Avenue, extending half of the apartment's length. The bedroom window was at the far end, away from the living room. Nothing short of a small explosion could be heard by anyone there. Closing the window to prevent invading cold air from eventually betraying him, he glanced across the street to the opposite high-rise and suddenly realized what a foolish risk he had taken. If anyone had been watching his apartment, the watcher would have seen his figure silhouetted against the window. Nonetheless, this was no time for recriminations, and there were no observers Elliot could detect. After doubling over the clothesline, Elliot looped it around the bottom of the railing. This was not only to maximize the usefulness of this now only 12-odd feet of rope, but also to minimize leverage on the rail. Now he tested the hookup by pulling against the line. It held. He wished there was a way to secure the rope around his waist, but there just wasn't enough for that. He satisfied himself with wrapping the line several times around his right wrist. The terraces were stacked directly on top of one another, so there would be nothing but air between himself and the ground 600 feet below while he was lowering himself. He would also have to swing himself out several feet once he was lowered, so he would have enough momentum to drop into the terrace underneath. Swearing not to look down, Elliot climbed over the railing, supporting himself with his left hand until he was standing with his back to the air and his toes wedged into the slim space between the bottom rail and the terrace concrete. He took a deep breath. Now came the tricky part. Gradually transferring support to the line without dropping onto it like a hanged man. He did not think the plastic line would stand such a jolt. No point delaying. Holding tight onto the line with his right hand and the railing itself with his left, Elliot began lowering himself to his knees until he was precariously balanced with his legs sticking out and his kneecaps tight against the bottom rail. Then, still holding the railing, he lowered his knees off the concrete and began transferring his weight to the clothesline. The rail began pulling out of the concrete. The next few moments blurred in Elliot's mind. All he knew was that he was suddenly hanging in midair with his legs flailing. There was a sharp pain in his right wrist as the rope bit into it, and there was no way he could lower himself any farther without letting go of the thin line that was between him and the ground. Don't look down, he told himself again. Then slowly, excruciatingly, he began pulling himself up.